The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Masai Mara as James Mitchell sat motionless on the red earth, cradling something precious in his arms. The wounded lion cub was barely breathing, its tiny chest rising and falling in weak, irregular rhythms. James whispered soft words of comfort, his weathered hands gentle against the golden fur matted with blood and dirt. The small creature weighed no more than 5 pounds, completely dependent on the human stranger who had found him dying. Behind James, the silence of the savannah was broken by the soft padding of massive paws on earth. He felt the presence before he saw it, a primal awareness that made every hair on his body stand on end. Slowly, without sudden movements that might trigger an attack, James lifted his eyes and looked over his shoulder. What he saw made his blood run cold. A massive male lion stood less than 10 feet away, its golden eyes fixed directly on him. The animal was enormous, easily 400 pounds of pure muscle and predatory power. Its dark mane flowed around a head the size of a truck tire, and its amber eyes held an intelligence that was both beautiful and terrifying. The lion's nostrils flared as it caught the scent of its injured offspring. James realized with crystal clarity that he was holding this magnificent creature's baby, and there was absolutely nowhere to run. Before we understand how James Mitchell found himself in this impossible situation, we need to go back to the beginning. And if you want to hear more incredible true stories about the unbreakable bonds between humans and wild animals, please subscribe to Wild Heart Stories. Every new subscriber helps us share these amazing tales that prove the heart has no boundaries in the animal kingdom. 6 hours earlier, the morning had started like any other research day in the Kenyan wilderness. Dr. James Mitchell, a wildlife veterinarian from Cornwall, England, had been working in the Masai Mara for 3 years as part of a conservation program dedicated to protecting the rapidly declining lion population. At 35 years old, James had devoted his life to understanding and preserving African wildlife, but nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for what was about to unfold. As James drove along the dusty track that wound between scattered acacia trees, his practiced eye scanned the landscape for signs of animal activity. Around 10 in the morning, he stopped near a cluster of fever trees to check one of the motion-activated cameras. Something on the ground caught his attention. Scattered across the red earth were clear signs of a violent struggle. The grass was trampled and stained with dark patches that could only be blood. Tufts of golden fur clung to thorny bushes, and unmistakable lion paw prints were etched deep into the soft soil. But these were not the only tracks. The distinctive whooping calls of hyenas echoed faintly in the distance. Following the trail of disturbed earth and scattered fur, James walked carefully through the thorny scrubland. 50 yards from the main battle site, he found something that made his heart sink. Partially hidden beneath an acacia bush, a tiny form lay motionless in the dappled shade. James knelt beside it, his breath catching in his throat. The cub was male, probably no more than 8 weeks old, with fluffy golden fur and oversized paws. Dark stains around its neck and shoulders suggested bite wounds, and its breathing was so shallow it was barely perceptible. James gently placed his hand on the tiny chest and felt the faintest flutter of a heartbeat. The cub was alive, but barely. In that moment, James faced an agonizing decision. As a wildlife veterinarian, he had sworn an oath to preserve and protect animal life. But interfering with natural processes in the wild was strictly prohibited by both conservation ethics and Kenyan law. Yet as James looked down at the dying cub, scientific protocols seemed meaningless.
James made a choice that would change everything. Carefully lifting the unconscious cub, he was struck by how little it weighed, probably no more than 5 pounds of fur and fragile bones. He carried the cub back to his Land Rover and drove as fast as he dared to the research station. For the next 6 hours, James maintained a constant vigil beside the makeshift incubator he had created. He cleaned wounds, administered antibiotics and pain medication, and started an IV fluid line. The cub remained unconscious throughout, but gradually its breathing became less labored and its heart rate stabilized. As evening approached, something remarkable happened. The cub's eyes fluttered open, revealing the deep blue color characteristic of very young lions. Instead of showing fear or aggression, the tiny creature simply watched James with growing curiosity, then made a soft mewing sound. Over the following days, the bond between James and the cub, whom he named Kovu, deepened beyond anything he had experienced with a wild animal. Kovu was curious about everything, watching James's every movement with intelligent golden eyes. During feeding sessions, the cub would curl up against James's chest afterward, purring with contentment, seemingly unaware that he belonged to one of Africa's most feared predators. But James was haunted by the knowledge that this arrangement could not last forever. 3 weeks after the rescue, Kovu had recovered completely from his injuries. The time had come to return him to the wild, even though the thought of separation tore at James's heart. James decided to release Kovu in the same area where he had found him. The morning of the release, he drove slowly back to the acacia grove. With trembling hands, he lifted Kovu out of the carrier one final time, holding the now sturdy cub against his chest. With a final gentle stroke of the golden fur, James set Kovu down on the red earth. The cub sat perfectly still for several seconds, looking back and forth between James and the vast wilderness beyond. Then, as if understanding his destiny, Kovu took his first tentative steps away. He paused to look back once, his golden eyes meeting James's, then turned and walked steadily toward the acacia trees. James watched until Kovu disappeared into the thorny scrubland, his heart heavy with loss, but proud of the choice he had made. As he turned to walk back to his Land Rover, he had no idea that this was not the end of their story. What James also did not know was that their every move had been watched by eyes much keener than human ones. The massive male that now emerged from behind the acacia trees had been tracking the scent of his lost son. He had arrived just in time to witness something no wild lion had ever seen before. Now sitting in the same spot where he had released Kovu hours earlier, James found himself face to face with what could only be the cub's father. Time seemed suspended as predator and human regarded each other across the red earth. James could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. But something unexpected happened. Instead of the explosive charge James anticipated, the lion stopped and slowly lowered his great head until his golden eyes were level with the cub in the human's arms. The massive predator simply stared at his offspring, nostrils flaring as he took in the complex scents. Then, in a moment that would be burned into James's memory forever, the lion opened his mouth and gently touched his tongue to the cub's forehead. It was the most tender gesture James had ever witnessed from a wild animal, a father's recognition of his injured child that transcended the presence of the human stranger who held him. The big cat then lifted his eyes to meet James's gaze directly. What the veterinarian saw there was not mindless aggression, but something far more complex and intelligent. The lion studied James's face for what felt like an eternity, those golden eyes seeming to weigh and measure the human who had dared to interfere with nature. After several minutes of this silent communication, the massive predator took a step backward and settled into a sitting position. He did not leave, but neither did he advance. Instead, he simply watched as James continued to cradle his injured son.
Slowly, carefully, James began to move toward his Land Rover, speaking in gentle tones.
To his astonishment, the lion rose and began to follow at a respectful distance, maintaining visual contact with his injured offspring. The journey back to the research station became the most surreal experience of James's entire career. Throughout that first night, James was constantly aware of the father lion's presence beyond the camp perimeter. The great predator never left his post, as if he understood that his son was fighting for life. This pattern continued for the next 3 weeks of Kovu's recovery. Every day, James would catch glimpses of the father lion somewhere in the vicinity, monitoring the situation and apparently approving of the care his son was receiving. When the day finally came for Kovu's release, James drove back to the acacia grove with mixed emotions. As he prepared to set Kovu down, a low rumbling sound carried across the savanna, so deep and powerful that James felt it in his chest. It was a lion's roar, filled with recognition and welcome. Through the scattered acacia trees, the father lion emerged, but now he was not keeping his distance. Instead, he was walking directly toward them with purposeful strides. Kovu immediately ran to his father, who greeted him with gentle nudges and affectionate grooming. But after several minutes of reunion, something extraordinary happened. The massive male began walking toward James, his steps deliberate and unhurried. The lion continued his approach until he was close enough that James could have reached out and touched his mane. Then, in a gesture that would be etched in James's memory forever, the massive predator lowered his great head and gently pressed his muzzle against James's outstretched hand. It was a moment of contact between species that transcended all boundaries, a wild father's acknowledgement of the human who had saved his son's life. 2 years passed. James had continued his conservation work, occasionally catching distant glimpses of lions that might have been Kovu. Life had returned to its familiar rhythm. On a Tuesday morning in late September, James set out alone on a routine data collection mission to a waterhole 15 kilometers from the research station. As he worked with his equipment, he became gradually aware that he was not alone. The usual sounds of the savanna seemed muted. Then he saw them. Emerging from a grove of fever trees, a pack of spotted hyenas was moving in his direction with purposeful gaits. James counted at least 8 adults. His Land Rover was too far away to reach safely, and the nearest climbable tree was more than 50 yards distant. The pack had spread out into a hunting formation, flanking his position. The lead female began making distinctive whooping calls, coordinating the pack's attack. James backed toward a cluster of boulders, knowing this was at best a temporary respite. The situation was becoming desperate when James heard something that made his heart stop. From somewhere behind the hyena pack came a deep roar that seemed to shake the ground. The effect on the hyenas was immediate. They spun around to face this new threat. A magnificent lion emerged from the fever trees. The animal was enormous, with a dark mane and distinctive scars on his shoulder. James's heart stopped. It was Kovu, but not the playful cub he remembered. This was a fully mature male lion in his prime, magnificent and terrible in his natural power. Kovu's appearance completely changed the balance of the confrontation. With a roar that contained all the fury of the African wilderness, he charged directly at the hyena pack. The spotted predator scattered like leaves before a storm. When Kovu stopped his pursuit and turned back, James felt tears streaming down his face. But the encounter was far from over. Another figure emerged from the trees, even larger than Kovu, with a mane so dark it was almost black. It was Kovu's father, the same magnificent male who had watched over his son's recovery 2 years earlier.
The older lion walked directly up to James and stopped less than 5 feet away. Then, in a gesture that defied everything scientists thought they knew about wild animal behavior, he lowered his great head
and gently pressed his muzzle against James' outstretched hand. It was the same gesture of acceptance and gratitude that had marked their first encounter, but now it carried the weight of time and memory. Kovu approached from the other side, positioning himself as protector rather than protected. For several minutes, James found himself surrounded by two of Africa's most magnificent predators, not as prey, but as something approaching family. The father lion began walking around the perimeter, marking territory and establishing a protective zone around the human who had saved his son. Kovu joined him in this territorial display, the two magnificent cats working together to create a sphere of safety around their human friend. When it came time for James to return to his vehicle, both lions escorted him, walking on either side like bodyguards. At the Land Rover, both repeated the gentle muzzle contact, a ritual of affection and recognition that transcended the barriers between human and animal. As James drove away, he could see both lions in his rearview mirror, standing side by side on the ridge where they had saved his life. He had been saved by the same cub he had rescued 2 years earlier, now grown into a magnificent adult who had remembered and honored the debt created by human kindness. James realized he had witnessed something that challenged everything the scientific community believed about animal cognition and emotional capacity. These lions had demonstrated memory, gratitude, and protective instincts that extended across species boundaries and persisted over time. The story that had begun with a dying cub and a desperate act of compassion had come full circle, proving that love once given freely creates bonds that neither time nor nature can break. James had saved Kovu's life, and now both Kovu and his father had returned the favor, demonstrating that gratitude is not uniquely human, but part of the universal language of the heart that connects all living beings. The lions had taught him that compassion creates connections that transcend understanding, and that sometimes the greatest gifts we receive come from the very creatures we sought to help.